The sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of Sweetwater Valley, where Emmett Blackwood had built his cattle empire from nothing but determination and calloused hands. At 53, the weathered rancher stood on his porch, squinting at the horizon where his lands stretched for miles. The Blackwood Ranch was the crown jewel of Wyoming territory, with its sprawling pastures and sturdy log mansion that stood as a testament to 2 decades of relentless work. His silver-flecked beard and deep-set wrinkles told stories of brutal winters, drought summers, and countless cattle drives that had forged both his fortune and his solitary existence. The evening breeze carried the familiar scents of sage and pine as Emmett contemplated the emptiness that had settled into his bones despite his success. The ranch hands called him the Iron Wolf behind his back, respected but feared, known for his fair wages and unflinching standards. None dared mention the loneliness that had hollowed him since his wife Sarah died, birthing a child that didn't survive either. Some 15 years passed. The massive dining table in his home seated 20, yet Emmett ate alone each night, the silence broken only by the clink of his utensils against fine china dishes no one else would see. His foreman, Jake Wilcox, had once remarked that Emmett's laugh had died alongside Sarah, buried in the small cemetery behind the ranch house, where 2 simple crosses stood against the mountain backdrop. As twilight deepened across the valley, Emmett made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would ride into town with a proposition that had been forming in his mind for weeks. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. Are you watching from Denver? Phoenix? Let me know in the comments below. Sweetwater was a growing settlement, no longer the rough outpost it had been when Emmett first arrived. Now it boasted a proper main street with a bank, general store, and the Golden Nugget Saloon, where most business was conducted over whiskey and cards. As Emmett tied his chestnut stallion to the hitching post outside Harrigan's General Store, he nodded curtly to townspeople who greeted him with a mixture of respect and caution. His presence always stirred attention, not just because he was the wealthiest man in the county, but because his visits were rare and purposeful. Today was no different, except for the unusual tension in his normally impassive face as he pushed through the door, the small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful contrast to his stern demeanor. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," called Benjamin Harrigan from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. "Been almost 2 months since we've seen you in town. What can I help you with today?" The storekeeper's friendly inquiry masked his curiosity about the rancher's unexpected appearance. The store was unusually quiet for a Saturday morning, with only Mrs. Peterson examining bolts of fabric in the corner, and young Tommy Wheeler staring longingly at the candy jars. Emmett removed his wide-brimmed hat, revealing hair that had once been black as coal, but now shimmered with strands of silver in the morning light, filtering through the dusty windows. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the store before settling back on Harrigan with unexpected hesitation. "Heard the Miller widow's been struggling since Thomas passed," Emmett said finally, his voice low and graveled from years of shouting orders across windy pastures. "Wanted to ask about her situation." Harrigan's eyebrows rose slightly as he leaned forward over the counter, dropping his voice to match Emmett's confidential tone. The storekeeper was the unofficial keeper of the town's secrets and sorrows, and he took this responsibility seriously. Thomas Miller had been a respected homesteader until fever took him the previous winter, leaving Eleanor Miller with 3 children and a farm she couldn't possibly manage alone. Emmett listened with uncharacteristic patience as Harrigan detailed Eleanor's proud attempts to maintain the property, her refusal of charity, despite growing debts, and her exhausting efforts to be both mother and provider. "She brings eggs and preserves to sell," Harrigan explained, gesturing toward a shelf where jars of golden peach preserves bore small handwritten labels. "Fine quality, too, but it's not enough. Bank's giving her till autumn before they'll claim the property." Emmett nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing as he purchased supplies. More than he needed, Harrigan noted, and added several jars of Eleanor's preserves to his order. As Emmett paid and gathered his purchases, he paused, fixing Harrigan with that penetrating gaze that had made hardened cowboys nervous. "Where's her property located exactly?" he asked, and Harrigan provided detailed directions to the modest farm at the eastern edge of the valley, wondering what the taciturn rancher could possibly want with the widow Miller. Eleanor Miller wiped sweat from her brow as she straightened her aching back, surveying the vegetable garden she had expanded after Thomas died. At 38, she retained the beauty that had once made her the belle of Denver society before she'd chosen love over luxury, following Thomas West to build a life from the unforgiving earth. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though rebellious tendrils escaped to frame a face that seemed too young for its burden of worry. The calluses on her once soft hands were badges of her determination, earned through endless labor to keep her children fed and the small farm functioning against mounting odds. Nearby, her children worked alongside her. James, 14, and already taking on a man's responsibilities. Emma, 12, and serious beyond her years. And little Sarah, just 8, but insistent on doing her share. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Eleanor turn, instinctively reaching for the shotgun leaned against the nearby fence post. Strangers could mean trouble, especially for a woman alone with children. James stepped beside his mother, tall for his age but skinny, his father's old hat too large for his determined face. They watched as a lone rider appeared, and Eleanor's grip on the shotgun tightened when she recognized Emmett Blackwood. Everyone knew the powerful rancher by reputation. Fair in business, but uncompromising. Generous to his workers, but solitary as a mountain lion. She had never spoken with him, though Thomas had occasionally mentioned him with a mixture of admiration and wariness. "Stay with your sisters," she murmured to James, who reluctantly stepped back as she moved forward to meet the unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Miller," Emmett said, removing his hat as he dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Up close, Eleanor could see the legendary rancher was older than she'd imagined, with deep lines etched around eyes that assessed her property with an unsettling thoroughness. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied coolly, not lowering the shotgun completely, though she kept it pointed at the ground. "What brings you to our farm?" She was conscious of her worn dress and dirt-smudged hands, but held herself with the dignity that even poverty hadn't diminished. Emmett seemed to hesitate, an uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing his face before he spoke again, his deep voice softer than his appearance suggested. "I have a business proposition that might interest you, Mrs. Miller. One that could solve your financial troubles." Eleanor's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd heard similar offers before, from the banker who hinted at arrangements that could extend her loan, from neighboring men who proposed marriage with barely disguised assessments of her land and livestock. "I'm not selling this farm," she said firmly, chin lifting slightly. "It's my children's inheritance and our home." A flicker of something that might have been respect crossed Emmett's weathered face. "I'm not interested in buying your land," he replied, then hesitated again before continuing. I'm proposing a partnership of sorts. I need someone to manage my household, prepare proper meals, and make the ranch house something more than just a place to sleep. He gestured toward her garden. You clearly know how to make things grow. My proposition includes a generous salary, a home for your children, and a share in the season's cattle profits. The proposition hung in the air between them, as unexpected as snow in summer. Eleanor's mind raced. The offer promised financial security, yet pride and suspicion made her wary. Why me? She asked bluntly. Sweetwater has no shortage of women who'd jump at such an opportunity. Emmett's gaze shifted briefly to the children watching from the garden, then back to Eleanor with an honesty that surprised her. Because you faced hardship without breaking. Because your preserves are the best I've tasted in Wyoming territory. And because I've heard you laugh, once, at last year's Founders' Day celebration, and it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked as he offered it to her. There's gold enough here to settle your debts immediately. Consider it an advance. Take a week to think about my offer. Eleanor didn't reach for the pouch, her practical mind searching for the hidden trap in such generosity. And what exactly would be my obligations in this partnership? The question carried all her unspoken concerns about a wealthy man's interest in a vulnerable widow. To her surprise, a flush of color appeared beneath Emmett's tan, and he shook his head firmly. Nothing improper, Mrs. Miller. You and your children would have the guest house, completely your own. I'm offering employment and security, not anything else. He placed the pouch on a fence post and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. I need capable hands and a civilizing influence at Blackwood Ranch. What I'm offering is a business arrangement beneficial to us both. With that, he replaced his hat, nodded once, and turned his horse toward home, leaving Eleanor staring at the pouch of gold and the dust trail of his departure. For 3 days, Eleanor alternated between hope and suspicion as she considered Emmett Blackwood's unexpected proposition. She consulted with Pastor Thomas, who admitted that while Blackwood rarely attended church, his reputation for honesty in business dealings was unquestioned. She discreetly asked Harrigan, who confirmed the rancher's solitary existence but fair treatment of employees. On the 4th morning, she made her decision. The banker's latest letter had made it clear, without significant payment, they would lose everything by harvest time. Eleanor gathered her children, explained the situation with the straightforward honesty she'd always shown them, and asked for their thoughts. James, protective and wary, objected initially. But practical Emma pointed out the advantages: a larger home, security, and education opportunities in a town that now boasted a proper schoolhouse. Little Sarah simply asked if they could bring their chickens. By afternoon, Eleanor had penned a careful acceptance letter, which James delivered to the ranch. 2 days later, the Blackwood Ranch wagon arrived, driven by foreman Jake Wilcox, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes that immediately set Eleanor at ease. Mr. Blackwood sends his respects, Jake explained, helping load their belongings. He's had the guest house prepared and said to tell you he'll be out on the North Range until tomorrow, so you can settle in without fuss. The journey took nearly 2 hours, revealing the true extent of Blackwood's empire as they traversed miles of his grazing land. When the main house finally came into view, Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. She'd expected something grand, but the sprawling log structure with its multiple wings, wraparound porch, and floor-to-ceiling windows was beyond anything she had imagined. A wilderness palace built by a man who apparently had no one to share it with. The guest house proved equally impressive, smaller but beautifully constructed, with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a modern cast-iron stove, and furnishings that Eleanor recognized as expensive imports from the East. Jake showed them around with grandfatherly patience, explaining the workings of the ranch and introducing them to Maria, the elderly Mexican woman who had been attempting to manage the main house for years. "Between us, ma'am," Jake confided as they unloaded the last of their belongings, "the boss hasn't had a proper meal in years. Man lives on coffee and whatever the bunkhouse cook sends over. This place needs a woman's touch, something fierce." Eleanor nodded, already assessing the situation with the practical efficiency that had kept her family alive after Thomas died. By nightfall, she had organized their new home, prepared a simple but hearty meal for her children, and made plans for the following day. As she tucked Sarah into a bed finer than any the child had ever slept in, Eleanor wondered about the enigmatic man whose gold had rescued them from ruin, and what exactly he expected in return. Morning brought Eleanor to the main house at dawn, determined to begin earning her keep immediately. The massive kitchen was well equipped, but showed little sign of regular use. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work, taking inventory, planning meals, and establishing order. By mid-morning, delicious aromas filled the house as she baked bread and prepared a hearty stew that would welcome the ranch owner home. James had already gone with Jake to learn about the cattle operation, eager to prove his worth, while Emma and Sarah explored the gardens with Maria's guidance. The isolation of the ranch house struck Eleanor forcefully as she worked. Despite its grandeur, it felt hollow, a monument to success without joy. She was arranging fresh-cut wildflowers on the enormous dining table when the front door opened and Emmett Blackwood entered, stopping abruptly at the transformation of his home. The rancher stood motionless, hat in hand, taking in the changes with an unreadable expression. The spotless entry hall, the lingering scent of baking bread, the flowers bringing color to rooms that had known none for years. "Mrs. Miller?" he acknowledged finally, his deep voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I see you've settled in." Eleanor straightened, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she faced her new employer. "Mr. Blackwood?" she replied with a nod. "Dinner will be ready at 6. I've prepared the study as you requested, with the ranch accounts laid out for review." She hesitated, then added, "I hope you don't mind, but I've aired out the east wing. It seemed neglected." Something flickered in Emmett's eyes, surprise perhaps, or discomfort at this direct reference to the unused portions of his home. "The East Wing was my wife's domain," he said after a moment, his tone neutral but final. Eleanor recognized the boundary being drawn and nodded respectfully. "I understand. It won't be disturbed again without your permission." An awkward silence stretched between them. Two strong-willed individuals, accustomed to managing their own domains, now navigating unfamiliar territory. Finally, Emmett cleared his throat. "Your son seems eager to learn ranching. Jake thinks he shows promise." The hint of approval in his voice was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt a small tension ease within her. "James has his father's way with animals," she replied, allowing a touch of maternal pride. "He's determined to become a man too quickly, but I'm grateful for Mr. Wilcox's guidance." Emmett nodded, then gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "The house smells good. It's been a while since—" He trailed off, seemingly uncomfortable, with the admission of how long his home had been without the simple comfort of home-cooked meals. That evening established a pattern that would continue in the weeks that followed. Emmett returned precisely at 6, washed up and took his place at the head of the massive table. Eleanor served meals that gradually coaxed appreciative comments from the taciturn rancher. Though conversation remained minimal and formal, the children initially ate separately in the guest house, until Emmett awkwardly suggested they might join him, a suggestion delivered gruffly, but with an underlying hint of something Eleanor gradually recognized as loneliness. James spoke of his days learning ranch work. Emma shared discoveries from her exploration of the property's flora, and little Sarah's innocent questions occasionally prompted what might almost have been a smile from their solemn host. Eleanor observed these interactions carefully, seeing behind Emmett's stern exterior to the man who had built an empire but had no one to share it with. Summer progressed, bringing the intense activity of the cattle business, branding, moving herds to higher pastures, and preparing for the autumn drive to market. Eleanor established herself as an indispensable force in the main house, bringing order to accounts that had been haphazardly maintained, organizing supplies, and creating a home environment that slowly began to soften the harsh edges of Emmett Blackwood's existence. The gold he had promised continued to appear monthly, far more than their agreed salary, always left discreetly in her kitchen with no mention made of it. She saved most of it, uncertain of how long this arrangement would last, unwilling to become dependent on generosity that might vanish as unexpectedly as it had appeared. Yet, as July turned to August, she found herself watching for Emmett's return each evening, taking particular care with meals she noticed he favored, and feeling inexplicably pleased when one of Sarah's stories finally provoked a genuine laugh from the man. The incident that changed everything happened on a scorching afternoon when Eleanor was alone in the main house. A commotion in the yard drew her attention. Several ranch hands were returning early from the range, and among them was Emmett, slumped in his saddle, his shirt torn and bloody. Heart pounding, she rushed outside as they helped him dismount, catching fragments of explanation. A confrontation with rustlers, an exchange of gunfire, a bullet that had grazed Emmett's side. "Get him inside," she ordered with calm authority that belied her inner turmoil. "James, ride for the doctor. Emma, bring hot water and the medical supplies from the pantry." Within minutes, Emmett was stretched out on his bed, grimacing as Eleanor carefully cut away his bloodied shirt to reveal a deep furrow across his ribs where the bullet had carved its path. "It's not fatal," Emmett ground out between clenched teeth, his face pale beneath his tan. "Just needs binding until the doctor arrives." Eleanor worked with swift efficiency, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss in pain, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Her hands steady despite her racing thoughts. The rustlers could have killed him. The bullet could have struck inches higher and pierced his lung or heart. The realization of how deeply this prospect disturbed her was almost as shocking as the injury itself. When had this stern, solitary man become someone she cared about? When had his well-being started to matter so intensely? Emmett watched her face as she worked, perhaps reading some of these thoughts in her expression. "I've survived worse, Eleanor," he said quietly, the first time he had used her given name. The doctor arrived, stitched the wound properly, and left strict instructions for rest that Emmett immediately tried to ignore. "The north pasture fence still needs mending," he insisted. Attempting to rise the following morning, only to be firmly pushed back against his pillows by Eleanor's surprisingly strong hands. Jake and the men have handled it, she informed him, with no room for argument in her tone. You'll stay in that bed until the doctor says otherwise. Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills until, astonishingly, Emmett yielded with a reluctant nod. The next few days established a new intimacy as Eleanor tended his wound, brought him meals in bed, and even read to him from a collection of Tennyson's poems she discovered on a forgotten shelf. Books that had belonged to his wife, he explained quietly, his eyes distant with memories he rarely shared. During those days of recovery, the barriers between employer and employee, widower and widow, began to dissolve. Emmett spoke of Sarah, his wife who had loved poetry and flowers, and had dreamed of turning the harsh ranch into a place of beauty before death claimed her too soon. In turn, Eleanor shared stories of Thomas, their early struggles, and the love that had sustained them through difficult years on the frontier. He would have liked you, she admitted one evening as she changed Emmett's bandages. Thomas always said, a person's worth was in their actions, not their words. Emmett's hand caught hers, surprisingly gentle for a man whose strength could break a wild horse. "And what do you think, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she hadn't heard before. She met his gaze steadily, no longer intimidated by the man everyone called the Iron Wolf. "I think you built walls higher than your fences, Mr. Blackwood. I'm beginning to wonder what they're protecting." By early September, Emmett was fully recovered and immersed in preparations for the cattle drive to Cheyenne. The evening before his departure, he requested that Eleanor join him in his study after the children were asleep. She found him standing by the window, silhouetted against the twilight, a glass of whiskey in his hand and an unusual tension in his powerful frame. "I'll be gone 3 weeks," he said without preamble. "Jake will remain behind to oversee things here." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I've had papers drawn up at the bank. If anything happens to me, this property passes to you and your children." The statement was so unexpected that Eleanor could only stare, trying to process its implications. "That's unnecessary," she finally managed, her voice not quite steady. "We've been fairly compensated for our work here. Your generosity has already secured our future." Emmett set down his glass and moved closer, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. "When Sarah died, I thought the capacity for caring died with her," he said, each word chosen with deliberate care. "I built this ranch, expanded it, made it the largest in the territory, because work was the only purpose left. I didn't realize I was just constructing an elaborate tomb for a man still walking." He took a breath, seeming to struggle with emotions long suppressed. "Then you arrived with your children, and suddenly there was life in these rooms again. Laughter at my table. Purpose beyond mere survival." His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind Eleanor's ear. A gesture so tender, it nearly undid her composure. "I promised you gold, Eleanor, but what I really wanted was something I thought was lost forever." The moments stretched between them, fragile as spider silk and just as binding. Eleanor felt the careful walls she had built around her heart since Thomas died, beginning to crumble, frightening and exhilarating in equal measure. "And what was that, Emmett?" she asked softly, using his given name for the first time. His smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude in an instant. "The sound of life, family, your laughter at my table." He took her hands in his, calloused palms against her own work-roughened skin. "I'm not asking for promises now, Just telling you that when I return, I hope to have a conversation about possibilities, about a future where what started as a business arrangement might become something more. Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, unexpected emotion welling from a place she had thought permanently sealed by grief. "I think," she replied carefully, "that would be a conversation worth having." The following morning, Eleanor and the children stood on the porch, watching as Emmett led his men and nearly 2,000 cattle eastward, the massive herd stretching across the valley in a living river of movement and dust. "Will Mr. Blackwood come back, Mama?" Sarah asked, her small hand tucked trustingly in Eleanor's. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's fingers gently, her gaze fixed on the tall figure on horseback that occasionally turned to look back toward the house that was no longer just a monument to success, but had become, against all expectations, a home again. "Yes, sweetheart," she answered with certainty. "He has promises to keep." The autumn sun caught the dust rising from the herd, turning it golden in the morning light, not the gold of coins or wealth, but the richer promise of second chances and hearts rediscovering their capacity for joy after long winters of grief. 3 weeks later, as promised, Emmett Blackwood returned to find Eleanor waiting on the porch, her smile welcoming him home to more than just his ranch. The cattle drive had been successful, bringing prosperity that would sustain them through the coming winter and beyond. But as he dismounted and climbed the steps to where she stood, both knew that the true wealth they had found was not measured in gold or land, but in the unexpected blessing of finding someone who understood the cost of loss and the courage required to risk loving again. That evening, laughter filled the great dining table once more. Not just Eleanor's, but Emmett's too, deep and rusty from disuse, but genuine. The sound echoed through rooms no longer hollow, promising a future neither had dared imagine when a solitary rancher had ridden to a widow's farm with gold in his saddlebag and an unspoken longing for something far more precious than any metal pulled from the earth.